Hello, everyone. This is Karl Selke. I'm an analyst and wargamer from a company called Group W. Um, been doing extensive defense wargaming basically for like the last 20 years or so. And what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about a tool that we actually developed over 14 years ago. That in the past 5 or 6 years we've been focused on going global with it in terms of taking advantage of some of the latest technologies to get it on the cloud environment for DoD. I'm joined by my colleague Will Ellerbe, who I've known for just about that long, to do from a software development perspective. He's one of the original software developers behind the Swift software, as well as the web-based version, and we'll talk a little bit about both here today. Okay, so just a brief agenda for this Connections Online presentation. We'll hit some history behind Swift and SwiftG, talk about a little bit about what we've done, what it can do, what it will do, and how you can use it too if you're part of the U.S. government or DoD umbrella, and some parting thoughts that I can philosophize a little bit on when it comes to computer-assisted wargaming and also distributed gaming in general. So what is Swift? So the standard wargame integration facilitation tool was what we called it. It's really about doing what the sentence here says, is looking at computer-assisted wargaming techniques to try to make a synthetic conflict environment where your war game is representational or as realistic as necessary and appropriate for what you're trying to do for your particular game design. So it's very much a tool for war game designers that want to get benefits of leveraging the computer. Some of the original ideas behind it came back in the 2000s. That I'll talk about in a minute. But if you're familiar with some of the old play-by-email systems and some of the systems today, like Vassal and that sort of thing, this is a re-look at those capabilities to be like, hey, from a defense analytic wargaming perspective, what do you actually need to be able to do to set up a computer game on DoD networks, execute that, analyze, how, consuming all those requirements is what the software was intended to do. But the purpose, from generally speaking, I think from a computer-assisted wargaming perspective, is you're trying to create a more rigorous environment for people to play conflict, as well as capture what went on in the game for follow-on analysis. Okay, so Swift in general. So I'll talk a little bit about it. We designed it with a couple of things in mind. The first one being game recording or recordation. This idea of in an analytic game, you want to be able to capture everything that took place, both from the player input perspective, objectively, subjectively, as well as the adjudication aspect. Maybe you have more adjudicators than just one. Maybe there's a combination of SME and algorithm-based adjudication, that sort of thing. You wanted to be able to capture anything that anyone did, affecting the state of the game or the design of the game throughout the game. And our mission when we were looking at this originally and still pretty much today was this idea of being agnostic to the particular game design that you're playing, whether, you're playing, let's say, if I take a commercial game analogy, if you're playing like Next War, or you're playing, Civilization, the idea with Swift was be able to instantiate those different games, their mechanics, change the scenarios to leverage those mechanics and adjudication processes. So what we did with Swift was essentially is model what a game is from a kind of turn-based strategy perspective. and then allow designers to build that and bring it to life and give them tools to automate and give players tools to understand the operational environment, and that sort of thing. A couple other things, take advantage of some of the computer strengths, in terms of actually having hidden information and playing out that in ways where you get into some more detailed, almost simulation quality adjudication for hidden information. Which I think really changes how a lot of these games are played. Two other points. So defensible and transparent adjudication. So this idea of moving away from this black box. So what we wanted to do with Swift was create modular adjudicators that were exposable and interrogatable. Not that all users have to do that, and they could use some black box model to adjudicate things, but the tenet was to, in essence, have your ways of adjudicating or ways of playing the game, that involve, additional development to be quite transparent, quite exposed, and then quite with the ability to interrogate it before and after the game to the extent that you want. That's pretty important for defense analytic games, to have that defensibility and that transparency in the adjudication. What did you model well? What didn't you model well? What were your assumptions? That kind of thing. But in general with Swift, design flexibility was the key. I've lost count of how many games, where much like the analog, approaches, you have to change the rules during the game. Something came up that you hadn't thought of, and you modify the rules on the fly. And we wanted to be able to preserve that to a large extent, in the computer-assisted world as well. You had to keep up the pace with the game designers, so to speak. So that's kind of a general overview of the Swift tool. You see there this idea of analyzing war as we create wargaming methods. Well, yes, every wargame is likely to be bespoke in some fashion or another. The modeling of war is something that we want to continue to evolve. So I want to get better at. I want my game to be more representational as I play that same game design again and again and again, to arrive at that truth-like status or verisimilitude that's appropriate for what I'm trying to do. And in many ways, we owe it to the warfighter to challenge adjudication as much as we can, particularly in defense analytic war games, to make sure we're getting that as right as we can. So just some of the past history. I felt in 2008 DoD was doing a lot of PowerPoint driven war games, and that was rather sad given where technology was at the time on the commercial world. Even the systems like ADCamp, Vassal, scenario editors were becoming very popular in a lot of the commercial computer games and that sort of thing. So appropriate some of that goodness in the DoD realm, and we did that. We did that with the Swift tool, with several years of design. So we focused on what are those core classes of the software, but what are those core features on top of a game. Making sure I'm not lost here.
Okay, Karl, this is Chris. We lost you briefly for about 5 to 10 seconds, so if you could repeat that thought. Okay, we appear to have lost him again. Are you there, Karl? Okay, Will, do you have any thoughts while Karl is troubleshooting?
Yes, I was trying to think of what the.
Yes, I'm back.
There he
Sorry
is. All
about that. Yeah.
Okay, we lost you for about 5 or 10 seconds there. You were talking about Swift development beginning, I believe.
Okay. Yeah. So in the 2009 timeframe, we began Swift development in earnest, focusing on the key features. So we looked at it through a user experience perspective, from the player side, from the adjudicator side, from the game designer side, and built around those capabilities. As we looked at what should a computer assisted platform be able to provide, and then in addition to that ontology of a game, what are the elements that you need to encapsulate any sort of game that someone could imagine from a strategy turn-based perspective. And then we went through just an immense number of trial by fire. So I would describe it as, we had a pretty strong vision, some pretty strong core principles, and we learned a lot about, user experience development over those years, I would say, of supporting different games, whether it was CNA games or J8 SAG-D games or AFRICOM games or OSD games, Marine Corps games, that sort of thing. Had a lot of experience supporting different kinds of things where the computer was used as a recordation mechanism primarily, to all the way up to you're playing a full-blown computer game with all the adjudication pretty much automated. And as we were engaging in that, technology continued to change. And we when we originally looked at this, you're on defense networks, you have to look at portability. So how do you maximize that? So our desktop was Java desktop application. That's the original version of Swift. And as we started to look at it, we really wanted to move to the cloud, as that was coming online in DoD. So we started in 2019 a reimagining of the Swift desktop software in the cloud. And then we began quite an interesting journey of how you go from that idea to actually get a shingle on a DoD cloud space where we can actually execute the application, and then all of the trials and tribulations associated with that from both the technology side and the security side, and the management of that from bandwidth side and that sort of thing. So we definitely had quite a journey to get to that point where we're at now, where we have a Swift G, a global web-based version of the desktop app that is now CAC enabled, that we can hit primarily right now at the alpha testing level, to look at, hey, some of the choices that we may have made without understanding the deployment environment that we were in. We were able to revisit some of those things and say, ooh, this worked, this didn't work, or this technology we have to shift to, as opposed to that, given the cloud environment that we expect to be working on into the future. So sort of where I guess I would summarize it from an application perspective. We started out with this notion that you could play distributed games from a common file directory, which was the desktop application, as well as being able to share files by email, which was currently available in the 2008 timeframe. So you could do distributed games either through some kind of organizational share drive, or just by passing files. And that allowed, distributed games in conference facilities, or if you have, organizational share drives that span sort of geography, become like that, was very much a doable thing. With Swift G, now you're in the browser. Now you can hit it across DoD networks in a far more portable, far more easier to manage way that centralizes most of it, so we can solve the security problem, once on different networks. But that was, I would say, probably one of the hardest things is to get to that point where you have that CAC-enabled solution that then you can test against and challenge some of your initial assumptions if you weren't able to access that environment out of the gates. Okay, so just in general, from a Swift perspective, and I've often showed this slide, and I debate always where to move the little black arrow, because we think about Swift from a DoD perspective. How many wargame designers are there really? And then of the wargame designers, how many of them are interested in computer-assisted applications? And of those, how many are interested in supporting analytic wargames? And that kind of sets the core users of the software into a relatively niche group, at least out of the gates, that are trying to get that capability to support Perella's cycle of research, support the data capture you need from games, support the ability to move and transition rather quickly between simulation and wargaming. So I like to think there's still some space, before we sort of max out there. But we have, from a Swift side, done dozens of games now for the Joint Staff, for the Marine Corps, for OSD, over the years. So the Swift application itself, the desktop version, has got a fair amount of use, and then we're working on the global version to make it actually usable on the cloud. But it's currently there right now. We're just doing some alpha testing of the technology. Okay, so that was a bit of some of the history. So what have we done? So with the Swift software over the years, we've supported all levels of defense wargaming, from tactical games all the way up to strategic. So you have your global-based games where the world is divided into regions, all the way down to you're moving your platoons or even fire team level units, towards some tactical objective. So that has been something pretty neat, from my perspective, because you're coming into this, in 2008, looking at it through a lens of how do we get beyond PowerPoint to do this, and how do we move beyond, some of the limitations on the analog side when it comes to computer-assisted wargaming. So we have that, I believe, provided that serious solution at the intersection of wargaming and simulation. So we can have algorithms that mimic, simulation level algorithms to do adjudication where appropriate, all the way up to using sims themselves to provide that adjudication. And that was something we always wanted to enable on the Swift side, the sort of model-based adjudication, where perhaps those models historically have been run in the kind of machine-only mode, where the analyst set up the scenario and hit go. And if you can expose those into more of a participatory solution, you've now kind of given yourself more tools in the toolbox. The other thing that we've been able to focus, which was again a key objective of having the software in the first place, is that, hey, as let's say I'm looking at the operational level of war and how air-to-air combat's adjudicated, I can now evolve that over time to look at, hey, how do I make this better and more defensible or easier or playable? So the computer game becomes less of a stale, oh my gosh, I did this once and I can't adjust it again, to this kind of living set of rules, much like the analog perspective was. And we've done that, at the tactical level, at the operational level, getting more into that at the strategic level as well. So that's fairly exciting. And I'll provide a link at the end of this where you can contact us to get more information. But just for the purposes of connections online, there is a fair amount of computer-assisted wargaming going on. There is a fair amount of attack at that cycle of research problem of how do you make that quicker, better, faster. So to summarize some basics of the Swift software. So Swift's target audience was the defense analyst and wargamer. It wasn't intended necessarily to move beyond that. We were looking at, hey, I'm on this rather poor defense machine, that they're a lot better than they used to be. that you want to be able to run on. So run on anyone's desktop machine that they have at their office was our requirement that we're going for, or laptops. Doesn't take facility and huge amounts of IT infrastructure to run. We wanted to be able to have this like, hey, this is your equivalent of I have my board and my counters, throw those out, start playing around, kind of thing. So that was the target audience, was in that defense analyst / wargamer role. I mentioned the user experiences from the designer, adjudicator, player differently. So we'll show some examples of that a little bit later. I mentioned SwiftG as that browser-based reimagination of Swift that's currently in development as well. And then I've touched on the extensibility of Swift in both versions, and that this has provided a significant area for creative growth. So by providing a platform, as you encounter different game designs, you naturally evolve the platform. So I'll give a specific example of that, related to grid type systems. So I remember, and Will probably remembers as well, in the early days, trying to understand line of sight. Hey, I'm at this grid cell, this other grid cell's 10 cells away. This is the terrain of the related properties between my cell and your cell. Do I have line of sight or don't I have line of sight? As an example, and it was fairly complicated from our original design, but the world had moved on, and there are amazing kind of grid packages and libraries and whatnot out there. So we've been able to take those and migrate those into the platform as well. So you can do all these things rather simply, and that gives you tremendous capability to support that style of games, from I want to customize and automate my adjudication perspective, or how the game is played, player restrictions, that sort of thing. Okay, so here's just a screenshot of the Swift, in this case, the desktop version of no particular, it's just showing a kind of a tactical fabricated scenario there. What you see in the image, it's actually, we created that in Hexographer years ago. It's just an experiment to stick it in there. So Swift itself, the desktop version, will take any image that you throw at it. So in this case, we created a hex grid in Hexographer, created a scenario with that, imported it into Swift, aligned the grids. So the cell, what Swift understands the cells to be, matches what's on the map. And then voila, you can start laying out your map and pieces there. You see the actual icon of the piece having a series of numbers on it and images. That is actually done automatically in Swift just by using what we call the actor drawing grid, which basically splices an icon into I think it's 4x4 space that you can control. And in terms of setting up what attributes you want to show. So the end result is dynamic icons, basically. So you don't have to constantly be swapping one image for another, that sort of thing. You're just building it, and it changes, as you go along. And that's just some of the automation that's baked into the application to be able to set up those and customize those however the designer wants. So this here is the designer view. So it largely work from a tree structure on the left. The bottom panel provides you basically a variety of different information. And then on the right there, you have a menu of a bunch of different options to do a bunch of different things, including screenshots and things like that. But the goal of the designer was, hey, expose the ontology of the game, allow you to populate it and connect the relationships to each other to then play this game. We recently played a version of this game that you see here at the, I think it was the Pacific Partners Conference, the Moores Conference, live. We did a actual tactical nuclear demonstration with Ditra at that game. where we actually had players, participants of the workshop play a scenario through where you could use tactical nukes. So this is another view of the designer where it's not a grid-based game, so you can build it however you want with actual lat longs. You're bringing in the units to the game as you see fit, and then managing it. We have a lot of waypoint type movement in a lot of the games that we do, where things are going at a certain speed. So you can, as you move into adjudication, you have a lot of forces moving different places at different speeds, looking at intersection and things like that as appropriate. And again, on the left there, you see some of the elements of what's in a game: action types, resource types, participants. So you set up your n number of participants, what they can control, whether they're red cell, green cell, blue cell, multi-sided game, two-sided game, etc. How many adjudicators? What can the adjudicators do? You're building those participants out. Your particular game, what's your order of battle, or something more abstract than that. From the Swift side, for both Swift and Swift G, we're looking at it from here are the actors. They take action. So the actors execute one or more of those action types, called turn actions in the actual event or in the actual game. So you'll be able to build those restrictions into it as well, of who can do what to whom. So it's just building that puzzle piece, if you will, looking at what that looks like. Your turn structure, is it simultaneous, in terms of the players are going at the same time? Is it you go, I go, that sort of thing? Is it some combination of them on different sub-turns? So you want to be able to build that and manage that into the process of how the players interact with the game, and what the game mechanics look like to handle those interactions. Player view. This is in our dark mode here of just showing a little bit there. So the players don't see the tree. That's too complicated. They can look at it and source their units through a couple different other ways. But the main idea was to capture that, what's going on, what actions are they taking, what units can do what. So you see some of that buttonology in terms of the actions that can be taken based upon what you've selected on and that sort of thing. So it tries to expose the game and try to restrict the players to doing things that are feasible in the case of a more structured game. So you can put in a lot of those feasibility rules or player restrictions, and unstructured, you don't have to have them either. Just another view of that. This actually shows here an example of a version of an air planner. So now you're dropping, let's say, missions down, and you have to source them from different air bases and how many airframes are involved in that. And this has evolved over the years to look at, if you're doing this kind of thing, how many tankers, how are you constrained by the flight hours of the aircraft, all those kind of dynamics that go into to air planning. How do we make a more realistic but playable version of that? So you're relying less on the players bringing that expertise always with them to the game, and can factor in some of those restrictions and make it relatively easy to do for the particular game that you're trying to do. So just an example of that kind of adjudication, or that kind of game extension that has been built into Swift for one version of the game or another. During the turn, getting results back, lots of different ways of doing that, from icons on the board itself. Hey, this is where EW attack zapped your UAV. This is where you took damage or lost some forces from a ranged fire. Providing conflict adjudication in terms of the kind of result window there. that sort of thing. So again, the ability to build all that in to meet the specs that you have as the game designer. So we tried to equip the Swift software to be able to hand a bunch of tools, and then the designers can massage them to get it where they want. And then if you are able to augment through some additional development, you can really do quite a bit. Okay, so that's just some quick looks at the Swift software overall here. Some points on artificial intelligence, because we get these questions a fair amount these days. So from the Swift perspective, we've done what the modern computer games do to overcome or make more realistic, whether you're in the real-time strategy game or the turn-based strategy game. We've done similar kinds of things, which is really you set up, some rules of engagement for your units to do certain things when triggered. So an example might be you could have in a tactical game, let's say you have a recon unit. What they want to do, right, when they spot the enemy moving, in their defensive turn, right, so the enemy's moving on their turn, they move forward, maybe they want to shoot and then they want to move. If you don't have that behavior built in, the enemy will eventually see that, let's say, and if that unit hasn't moved out, just because of the artifacts of kind of a you-go-I-go system, let's say, then I'll be able to shoot and take out that unit. So this idea of reacting to the environment and then operating under some set of logic, and then building that in to be relatively dynamic and doctrinal if necessary, but at least logical, is, I think, a hallmark of most computer games these days. So you have to, and we have brought that into it, as well. The other thing, being able to connect with other constructive simulations or other tools, gives you a large variety of different things you can do as well. If you're doing, let's say, a theater level game and you're adjudicating it with a theater level model or simulation, but you're exposing that simulation in essence to the warfighters by taking the situation data from the simulation, exposing it to the players, then having the players then react and provide input that then goes back into the simulation, is an interesting tool to add into the kind of M&S toolbox. And a lot of the simulations weren't, though that's changing now, weren't created years ago with that sort of design prospect in mind. So using Swift as the front end for that capability actually comes in handy. I mentioned the data-driven simulation quality adjudication techniques. So just kind of good M&S or operations research modeling of the phenomenology is definitely something you could do. You can do that poorly as well. Swift won't judge you either way, but usually your players and sponsors do. And as you get into it, in terms of the, handling some of the all domain type effects, that is something we've definitely got into there as just an example that penetrating enemy air defense, range of offensive, defensive missiles in play, their PKs against each other, all that kind of stuff. I get the question on computer opponents quite a bit, and I think in the Swift G realm, that's actually more exciting to me than the desktop realm. Just being able to go launch a game and start playing against a computer opponent has some, especially if I can do it over the browser, has a lot more potential, I think, to it. We haven't focused too much on that from a modeling the the full up computer player as opposed to the rule of engagement kind of unit behavior stuff that I mentioned. Though certainly we've looked at that from a DARPA and an academic environment, but it hasn't been a major feature yet of what we've been looking at. So this slide here is kind of the big vision, or a big vision, I should say, of the SwiftG software, where imagine on different TOD type networks, or even educational networks for that matter. if it was like command and staff or something like that. With this library of games that you could play that have largely been, constructed for a purpose, whether it's from on the defense side, so not, necessarily a cloud to play commercial games, which is really cool too. This would be basically a cloud to play GOTS type games, I guess I should say. And then, have that user experience centralized, through the browser for all those things from the designer side, the analyst side, the adjudicator side. And then as you move to the right there, which is very attractive to us because we've in essence implemented this from a desktop version perspective, but envisioning this on the cloud, that'll be very fascinating to get to. And as you're able to build these representations, being able to grab them and share them, sort of a common mechanics repository is very enticing. Definitely use that now in the Swift community, but in the Swift G side, that's even more fascinating to me. And then, being able to expose in the cloud environment now, connected to, AI systems to actually play the game, a gazillion times, and do that kind of exploration is also something I think more in the realm of the possible as we build this out. So just think from a Swift G perspective, first make it work, be able to play games, get sort of that goodness out of supporting any particular game through a computer assisted way, and then over time kind of build this enterprise to, hey, we played this game like 20 different times with variations of the scenario. How do you start analyzing that, looking at that, enabling the game designer to do even more? So we're thinking through a lot of those questions. Okay. So accessing Swift and eventually Swift G. So we have an IntelLink site. So if you have a common access card, you can request permission to get on that site. Link for beta testing from the Swift G perspective is pending. We're still sorting through some of the new realities of the cloud environment that we're facing. And then I'll make a plug for, I gave a more kind of general talk on computer-assisted wargaming from my perspective a couple years ago to Georgetown that does hit on some of the philosophy of gaming that I did not bring to this presentation. When it comes to distributed wargaming in general, and I'll move it here. I think that this has been seen through numerous presentations that I've witnessed to date. Technology is friend or foe. So distributed games are not my preference, at least not distributed from a around the world perspective necessarily. I think it becomes very difficult to do that with time zones and all that. Certainly technology can help with the asynchronous, support for some of those things. We have done it, with some of the combatant commands, and it, people work weird hours to try to line up as best we can from a game designer perspective. So there's pros and cons, but what we have found incredible utility in the distributed capabilities is even within the same conference center where people are dispersed. It allows for unrivaled access to the common operating picture, allows for updates in real time, it allows for the capturing of chat information as they're executing, and that's worked out incredibly well for us. And I would say most of our games are done that way now. So the exposure of the what's going on in the war game particularly as you get larger, which is where these distributed games tend to reside. You have more and more, increasingly more participants there. By being able to distribute the COP and leave that to be scrutinized in a distributed, disaggregated fashion, yields the potential, at least, for a better understanding of what the current game state is. And that's been very challenged from some of the kind of board-driven games where you have to go up to the board to look, and there's a huge stack of pieces on the board, and you can't really see. But again, technology can be a friend of foe. The other thing in using the software itself, if you're coming from a kind of a board game background, you definitely want to shift your paradigm a little bit, because the computer, has strengths and weaknesses as well, and being able to approach that at the very beginnings of your design for a computer game, I think is appropriate. Where yes, you could replicate a board game approach, but it may not actually lead to the best outcome. And I have lots of examples, around that. And then, we often speak to modeling the, understanding the human decision making in war games. One of the things I've spoken on a couple times over the years, that, as an analyst, if I want to understand something, we usually create a model of that something, to then be able to interrogate and put in different situations and that sort of thing. So modeling the player, I think, is a natural outcome of computer-assisted wargaming, where you get that, you get the requisite detail that you need in execution to look back and say, okay, this was the situation they were facing. This is what they chose to do. This is what they said about it, maybe in some after actions or, player notebooks or that sort of thing. Can I, in effect, create, a way of understanding their decision logic, and then eventually, moving that to, computer type opponents and things like that. So a lot of potential there, in the Swift platform. So those are some kind of thoughts that I had on it. Again, just to summarize, from a distributed wargaming perspective, all kinds of things can go wrong. Usually we'll send operators out to different locations if we can, if they're expected to do stuff in the tool, versus just create PowerPoints for others to implement. But the technology, in order to bring that game in a more representational, more realistic way to players, even just distributed across a conference room or even the table itself, I think is a great contribution. So with that, I'll take some questions, and then I'll turn it over to Will, and Will may have some comments too.
Yeah, Carl, so you have a couple of questions here. First question is, what sort of input and output formats are available? I'll let you answer the Swift one. I will say that for Swift Global, that because it has to convert the game over from Swift Desktop, it takes multiple formats, including CSV, JSON, etc. Swift, and you can correct me if wrong, I haven't, is still CSV, but CSV is something that you can use Excel to import and export as well.
So I'll add a couple points to that. I mean, so one is, what we did not want to do with the software was create something that required lots of clicks. So if you had a spreadsheet of, let's say, your order of battle with the various attributes of the units or unit characteristics, or unit properties, or whichever word you want to use, Swift uses attributes. You just basically format it relatively simply into rows and import that in. So now you have your order of battle in the system pretty quick. That is the default kind of way of getting a lot of data in there, whether it's geographic data or actor, unit type data. You can import quite a bit as far as geographic regions and information on those regions and shape files and different things like that. Over the years, we've done lots of different kinds of things with it from an input perspective. You can also build your own things, because we have button press. Hey, this is the simulation. It's passing us this data. Now we've ingested, let's say for a campaign level model, here's your starting data, at D+5 or D+25, with just a button click. So that's like extra custom stuff that you build, if you have a defined requirement. But out of the gates, it does the CSV similarly with output. You can export that out. You can export out screenshots as well, of varying degrees across the game spaces you can have. So I think we probably.
And Karl, you may want to piggyback before we get to the second one there. Another question is, can Swift playback what happened for that flag briefing?
Yeah, so a lot of it depends on the, how exciting that is. Depends upon the data, governing the game. So we have, from the Swift side, we have a sitmap, situational map type capability that looks, on the current turns that, hey, here's what happened. This unit moved here, and that sort of thing, and very much a strategy turn-based perspective. We've ported that to Google Earth to do videos for like the commandant and that sort of thing, in the past. We've also, from a Swift G perspective, we're looking into different playback capabilities if you have a lot of that detailed data. So in some cases we have a simulation adjudication. Because that data exists, you can do a video playback, see the missiles flying, based upon the players plans that they selected during the game and that sort of thing. So it's largely game dependent how exciting it is, but certainly being able to jump back to different states of the board, if you will, is very important. Understanding the game thread through the turns is very important. Capturing that data by turn is very important from the Swift software perspective. I'll hit the time steps. So you can be as sort of abstract and explicit as you want. So we have one game where people are planning an actual time, in space. So I want to do this at 1800 hours, and it's going to last, for 2 hours. I'm going to do that, so you can get as finite into that as you want as far as time within a turn-based game. If you're planning, those are usually for where I'm planning for, let's say, the next 12 hours or the next 3 days. And then I want to execute that plan, and my opponent also has a plan that they're executing, and we look at the clash of those, as the adjudication, goes from adjudication block of time to the next block, to you're essentially playing checkers. Time's completely irrelevant. So you can handle. You have enough rope to hang yourself, basically. In terms of how you deal with time in your game perspective. But Swift tries to be able to keep track of that if you have time within the turn. Yeah. So Vassal was one of the inspirations of Swift from back in the day. So I used AD Camp extensively in the 2000s. Play by email. You're pushing the button to roll the dice for you, kind of thing. But didn't do much else than that. Wasn't particularly none of the capabilities back then in particular were meeting the analytic requirements, and exposing the results in ways that we wanted now, where I could quickly tabulate. Let's say I want to do show a heat map of this kind of event that occurred across these different areas across the last 4 turns, those kinds of things. So as a research tool, and I think I have a brief that we gave at either Moores or Connection several years ago about comparing Swift and Vassal. As a research tool where you actually care more perhaps about what happened at the game, in terms of the gameplay itself. where it's not just living in the player's minds only as the major outcome of the game, but you actually want to capture that game and be able to scrutinize it and interrogate it and potentially branch off from it at different points. Swift had a lot of capabilities with respect to that, and I think from a Swift G perspective, we're going for that same level of auditing the wargaming process. I mean, we went so far as to, not that people would often execute this, but every action that you take, you can associate different files with it. So let's say they have so the idea would be I could look back, 2 years later, all the files that the players created separately were in an organized fashion as you stepped turn by turn. Hey, this is describing this action in more detail. Maybe I put in some files for that. Maybe it's just description language, but you could, in effect, have everything nicely organized so that you could walk back and try to relive and understand as much as you could. That was the intent, and I think we got there. Will, do you have any comments on that from a Swift global perspective?
Nope, that hits it on the nose.
Yeah, go ahead.
And did you go into the last one with the post? Yeah, the post game analysis. Yes. I will say this: if I can share my screen, let me share my screen here. From the perspective of a couple of these answers, and I could kind of relay them towards, like we were talking about with Swift G, is let me see here. Screen. 1 second. Let's see. Actually, the first thing you see here is actually the desktop version that Karl was referring to. With the one game, and we did take it. So, and this here is just to flash this up real quick, just to show you the basis for Swift G, and because we're taking the lessons learned from Swift G and we're applying, like Karl's mentioned, the advantages of the web while still building upon the games and functionality of the desktop. So all the games, all the library of games that we will start with Swift G will be the same library of games that came from from 2010 of what we had built from there. So this is that game built into Swift G. Some of you may have seen this game before. I won't stay too long on this because you've seen it because a lot of people have already seen this, but you have obviously distribution is a given because it's on the web, but what Swift G adds to it is really where it shines, not just because of the distribution, but because of like the tools that you have easily accessible, such as Karl was talking about before with the actor drawing grid and like how these are all dynamic. So all the functionality that came with the desktop version, we're making sure that we incorporate it into Swift G, along with even here the ability of, Karl talked about this being an image that was that was set based upon who you are. This is actually a mil C2525. I always get the order in there image, but in Swift G we can actually just use the code and use a tool that's out there that just draws it for us. You also have the ability, you have distance, the same thing. Think of this as Google Maps, and I'll show a different game real quick here. I'm going to show that other game right now for time. Let's see here. And when we're talking about, you're asking about the inputs and export. For input, this is actually a game from Storm, which is a campaign model game where we took the actors and we were able to import all the units and their properties into this game. And this is also kind of to show Swift Global at a larger scale. This is a visualization game. The other game is a game that has adjudication, as Karl talked about, but this is just manual adjudication where I can come in here and I can click on a unit and I can just create a generic action that can then be modified from by the white cell. Also the ability to, if you've ever used Map of the World, or you're able to pull pull GeoJSONs and KML and things like that. Global makes it a lot easier for, say here, these are all the military bases that are around the DC area. Actually, it has them all around the entire country. You have railroads. And I don't know if you notice the railroads coming in. You also have the ability to change the background. These are things that, you know, with SwiftG gaining and evolving into that, making everything dynamic as best we can. We could even potentially do live data. But, and the other thing, so I want to point out, yeah, for the input output, we have this data coming in here, playback. There's other tools that we can play back the data that we have in here. Same thing with, I don't know if we have any results in this one. Let me show you the original game here. Like here, the same results that Karl showed, but just to show that this is information that we are pulling and just making better within SwiftG and the website. This is showing the results in the playback error. With playback, you could show who did what. Let me see. Just to touch on another thing before we can go back and ask some questions. Also is the lobby. The lobby allows you to have a stores of games. So here are my games that I'm playing, that I'm either involved in or I created. You have the ability, like here, they're all set with a gear. So those are the games that I can go modify. There's also the ability to play or initialize the game. There's statuses of the game. You can pause the game. You can complete a lot of this stuff is in addition to what we have with Swift that we've able to gain from going to the web. Your turn, you have the ability, obviously, to delete and copy a game, but to branch a game. You can actually branch a game. So say you're playing a game and you want to see what happened if the unit didn't go left, but the unit went right. You can now branch a game. A lot of the stuff can be done in SwiftG, but it's a lot harder to implement and to make user-friendly as well. There's also the ability, I think Karl talked about the scenario. So I could take that game, that tactical game, this initial game that was, say, situated in Michigan, and I can move it to Boston, and I can base it off the tactical game, the first game you saw there with the hexes. And then I could change the adjudication system. I could make it the Stratego adjudication system, or I could do a multitude of ways of creating a different scenario. And creating the game, I have the ability to choose that new one that I created. And actually, there's a tactical version 3 here, which is a scenario off of tactical. If I choose tactical here, I have the ability to have a facilitator. So I'm not the only person changing, pausing the game if we don't want somebody to act on the game. I can set the date for the game so it begins and ends at a certain point. I can set the game for staging, for putting in the missile data, or set it in progress. Karl talked about the participants. All this same stuff. Observer. You can have observers come into the game. That what they can do is just look at the game and do, but they can't create actions. If I was creating, so when I create these games, just go back to, where was this one? This game here, and I don't know if you want to talk about the future of where this is going, such that we did pull the actors in here to pull their locations, the lat longs, and their actual values, but also these actors are pulled from Storm, which we do have Storm to Swift and eventually Storm to SwiftG. So being able to run that campaign model game from SwiftG from the web.
Yeah, it's just an example of lots of different things that we're looking at, trying to enable from both the analytic side and also from the education side too. I think there's some benefit here as well, as so you're not just constrained to commercial computer games. Okay. Any other questions?
Did you have a last slide, Carl, or is that it?
That was it. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Really appreciate everyone's attention to this, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any further questions.